My name is Commander Jackson Reeves, former NASA astronaut. 30 days ago, Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into an ice age that killed millions. I survived using my space training while watching civilization collapse around me. My wife and daughter are missing somewhere in frozen Colorado, and I have to find them before I freeze to death or starve. This is how I survived the first 30 days when summer died and winter never ended. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. Name is Commander Jackson Reeves, and I need to tell you about the day the world ended. Not with nuclear war or alien invasion, but with something far worse. Something that turned summer into the longest winter humanity has ever known. It was July 15, 2024. I was staying at the Marriott downtown Denver, room 1847. I remember that number because I kept staring at it on the door, thinking I'd be checking out in a few days to fly home to my wife Sarah and my daughter Emma in Colorado Springs. I had no idea I'd never see them again, at least not for 30 days. I was consulting for SpaceX on their new lunar habitat project. After 20 years with NASA and 3 missions to the International Space Station, private companies liked having former astronauts review their life support systems. It was good money, and Sarah always joked that it was safer than my old job. She had no idea how wrong she was about to be. That morning started like any other. I woke up at 6:30, grabbed coffee from the lobby, and spread out my laptop and technical manuals on the small desk by the window. The SpaceX engineers had sent me specifications for their closed-loop life support system, and I was checking their calculations for oxygen recycling and water reclamation. In space, you learn that life support isn't just about keeping people alive. It's about understanding exactly how long your resources will last when there's no possibility of resupply. I should have paid more attention to that lesson. At 9:43 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. The first one said there had been a major seismic event at Yellowstone National Park. I switched on the news and watched footage of what looked like the biggest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The reporters were calling it unprecedented, but they kept reassuring everyone that this wasn't the supervolcano eruption that scientists had been warning about for decades. They said it was manageable. They said it was contained. They said life would return to normal within weeks. They were wrong about everything. I called Sarah immediately. She picked up on the second ring, and I could hear Emma laughing in the background. They were at her parents' house in Colorado Springs visiting for the summer. Sarah sounded concerned but not panicked. The news was showing ash clouds moving east away from Colorado. The meteorologists were predicting some atmospheric disturbance, maybe a few degrees cooler temperatures for a month or two, but nothing catastrophic. Emma got on the phone and told me about the swimming lessons she was taking at her grandparents' community pool. She was 12 and had finally conquered her fear of diving. She wanted to show me her perfect dive when I got home on Friday. I promised her I'd be there to watch. I told her I loved her and handed the phone back to Sarah. Sarah asked if I thought we should be worried. I told her I'd keep monitoring the situation, but that volcanic eruptions were usually regional problems, not global ones. I had studied atmospheric science as part of my astronaut training, and while Yellowstone was big, the Earth's atmosphere was bigger. I told her to enjoy her time with her parents and that I'd see her in a few days. That was the last normal conversation I ever had with my family. The hotel guests that first day were treating the whole thing like an interesting news story. The bar was full of business travelers watching the coverage, ordering drinks and making jokes about how this would be a great story to tell when they got home. A group of pharmaceutical salesmen at the table next to mine were taking bets on how long it would take for flights to resume. One of them had a wedding to attend in Phoenix that weekend and was getting increasingly agitated about potential delays. I kept working on the SpaceX specifications, but I found myself glancing at the weather app on my phone every few minutes. The temperature in Denver that morning had been 82 degrees. By noon, it was 79. By evening, it was 75. For July in Colorado, that was unusual but not alarming. The ash started falling that night. I watched from my 18th floor window as gray flakes drifted down like snow. The hotel staff assured guests that this was temporary. The local news stations were calling it a minor inconvenience. They said city crews would have the ash cleaned up within days. But I'd spent years in space looking down at Earth's weather patterns, and something about the way that ash was falling bothered me. It wasn't dissipating the way normal volcanic ash should. It was too thick, too consistent, and it wasn't being carried away by wind patterns. Instead, it seemed to be settling into the atmosphere like a blanket. On the second day, I woke up to complete darkness outside my window. The ash cloud was so thick that streetlights were still on at 8 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to 71 degrees. I called Sarah, but the call went to voicemail. I tried again an hour later and got through. She said they were fine, but that ash was falling in Colorado Springs too. Emma was disappointed because her swimming lessons had been canceled. The pool was covered in gray dust. The hotel restaurant was still serving breakfast, but I noticed they had run out of fresh fruit. The manager explained that their regular supply trucks were having trouble with visibility on the highways. Several flights had been canceled at Denver International Airport, and the taxi drivers were complaining about the ash clogging their air filters. I spent that day in the hotel business center, researching everything I could find about volcanic winters. What I learned made my stomach drop. Major volcanic eruptions in the past had caused global temperature drops lasting years, not weeks. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 had caused crop failures worldwide and led to famine. The Toba supervolcano eruption 74,000 years ago had nearly driven humanity to extinction. But those were ancient history. Modern civilization had technology, infrastructure, global supply chains. We could handle a temporary disruption. We had to be able to handle it. On the third day, I couldn't see the building across the street from my window. The ash had turned day into perpetual twilight. The temperature was 68 degrees and I was wearing a sweater in July. I tried calling Sarah 6 times. 3 calls went to voicemail. 2 calls were dropped. 1 call connected long enough for her to tell me that Emma had developed a cough and that ash was getting into everything despite keeping the windows closed. The hotel staff was starting to look worried. I overheard 2 housekeepers talking in Spanish about their families in Mexico. One of them was crying. The desk clerk told me that they were having trouble reaching their corporate headquarters in Atlanta. Phone lines were overloaded across the country as people tried to contact family members. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I went to the hotel gift shop and bought every energy bar, bag of nuts, and bottle of water they had. I told the clerk I was stocking up in case room service became unavailable. She looked at me like I was overreacting, but she rang up my purchase without comment. I also bought a small camping stove and fuel canisters from the business traveler section. In space, you learn to prepare for system failures before they happen. The pharmaceutical salesmen from the first day were getting increasingly agitated. 2 of them had rented a car and tried to drive to the airport, but they came back an hour later covered in ash and saying the roads were impassable. Visibility was down to maybe 50 feet, and abandoned cars were already blocking major intersections. One of them kept calling his wife, screaming into the phone about how this wasn't supposed to happen. On the 4th day, I woke up to a temperature of 63 degrees. The ash outside my window was falling so heavily that it looked like a gray snowstorm. I could barely make out the glow of streetlights through the haze. The hotel's air conditioning system was making strange noises, and I suspected the ash was clogging the filters. I tried calling Sarah and got a busy signal. I tried 10 more times over the next hour and couldn't get through to any number. The hotel's internet was working intermittently. When I could connect, news websites were reporting that the ash cloud had spread across the entire western United States and was moving east faster than predicted. International flights were being canceled. The stock market had suspended trading. That evening, I met the people who would share the next week of hell with me. Margaret and Harold were in their 70s visiting Denver for their 50th wedding anniversary. They had been supposed to fly home to Kansas City on the 16th, but their flight had been canceled. Harold had a heart condition and was worried about running out of his medication. Margaret kept apologizing for being a burden, but I told her that in survival situations, experience and calm thinking were more valuable than physical strength. Lisa was 24, traveling with her 6-month-old baby daughter. She had been visiting her sister in Boulder, and was supposed to fly back to her husband in Tampa. The baby had started coughing that morning, and Lisa was terrified about getting medical help if the cough got worse. She looked at me with desperate eyes and asked if I thought they would be able to leave soon. I didn't have the heart to tell her what I was really thinking. On the 5th day, the temperature was 59 degrees. The hotel restaurant had stopped serving breakfast because their food deliveries hadn't arrived. The manager held a meeting in the lobby and explained that they were operating on emergency procedures. Guests were welcome to stay, but services would be limited. Several guests decided to try walking to the train station or bus depot, thinking they could find alternate transportation. None of them came back. I spent that day teaching Margaret, Harold, and Lisa basic resource management. We consolidated our supplies and moved into one suite to conserve body heat. I showed them how to ration food portions and how to calculate how long our supplies would last. Lisa's baby was coughing more frequently, and I could see the worry in her eyes growing deeper. Harold pulled me aside and quietly told me that he only had enough heart medication for another week. He didn't want Margaret to worry, but he needed me to know in case something happened to him. I promised him we would find medical help before his medication ran out, but privately I was starting to understand that help might not be coming. The 6th day changed everything. I woke up at 6 in the morning and looked out the window to see something that shouldn't have been possible. White flakes were falling alongside the gray ash. It was snowing in Denver in July. The temperature was 54 degrees and dropping. I watched those snowflakes fall and felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. In space, when you see your life support systems failing, you have protocols to follow and backup systems to engage. But there are no backup systems for an entire planet. I called Sarah one more time. The call connected, but the line was full of static. I could barely make out her voice saying my name before the connection died. I tried calling back dozens of times, but I couldn't get through. The cell towers were either overloaded or failing. That evening, I stood at the window watching snow accumulate on the ash-covered streets of Denver. 3 inches had fallen in 6 hours, and it showed no signs of stopping. The streetlights were starting to flicker as the power grid struggled with the unprecedented demand for heating. Margaret asked me what I thought was happening. Harold and Lisa were looking at me too, waiting for an answer from the astronaut, who was supposed to understand these things. I looked at their faces and realized they were counting on me to have solutions, to be the expert who could fix this. I told them the truth. I said that volcanic eruptions could cause temporary climate disruption, but that modern civilization was resilient. I said that emergency services would adapt, that supply chains would find alternate routes, that we just needed to be patient and careful until normal weather patterns returned. But as I watched that impossible snow continue to fall through the ash-filled sky, I was already running calculations in my head. How long could we survive on our current food supplies? How cold could the hotel rooms get before we risked hypothermia? How long could the power grid function under these conditions? The answers to those questions terrified me, but I kept them to myself. Sometimes leadership means carrying the weight of knowledge that others aren't ready to hear. In space, we call it maintaining crew morale during a crisis. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to learn that some crises are too big for morale to matter. The snow was still falling when I finally went to sleep that night. Through my window, I could see that it was already covering the abandoned cars on the street below. In the distance, I could hear the faint sound of sirens, but they seemed farther away than they had the day before. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine Sarah and Emma safe and warm in Colorado Springs. I told myself that tomorrow would bring answers, that someone would figure out how to fix this. I told myself that this was temporary. I was wrong about everything. I woke up on day 7 to a world that had turned white overnight. 6 inches of snow had fallen in July, covering the ash that blanketed Denver like some twisted winter wonderland. The temperature outside was 48 degrees and still dropping. I pressed my face against the cold window glass and watched people stumbling through the streets below, their summer clothes completely inadequate for conditions that belonged in January, not the middle of summer. The hotel's heating system was running constantly now, making groaning sounds that reminded me of a spacecraft under stress. I had heard those kinds of mechanical protests before, usually right before something important failed. The lobby thermometer read 62 degrees when it should have been maintaining 75. That meant the system was already losing the battle against the cold. I found Margaret, Harold, and Lisa huddled together in the suite we had claimed as our base of operations. The baby was coughing more frequently now, a wet sound that made Lisa's face tighten with worry every time it happened. Harold was moving slowly, his breathing more labored than it had been the day before. Margaret was trying to stay positive, talking about her grandchildren back in Kansas City, and how this would all make for quite a story when they got home. I didn't have the heart to tell her that I was starting to doubt any of us would make it home. The hotel restaurant had closed permanently. The manager, a thin man named David, gathered the remaining guests in the lobby that morning to explain the situation. Food deliveries had stopped completely. The roads into Denver were impassable due to snow and abandoned vehicles. Emergency services were overwhelmed and couldn't respond to non-life-threatening situations. The hotel would continue providing shelter as long as possible, but guests needed to understand that they were essentially on their own for food and supplies. Most of the remaining guests panicked. A businessman from Chicago started screaming about his rights as a paying customer. A young couple from California demanded that the hotel arrange alternate transportation immediately. 3 college students decided they would walk to the airport, convinced that flights had to be resuming soon. I watched them leave through the lobby doors wearing shorts and flip-flops, carrying small backpacks. The snow was already 8 inches deep and still falling. I never saw any of them again. That left about 15 people in a hotel designed for 300 guests. The pharmaceutical salesman had left the day before, determined to drive south toward warmer weather. The anniversary couple who had been staying on the floor above us had checked out that morning, saying they would rather take their chances on the road than wait for rescue that might never come. Lisa asked me what I thought we should do. Harold and Margaret were looking at me with the same expectation, waiting for the astronaut to have answers. The truth was that my training told me to assess resources, establish shelter, and wait for rescue while conserving energy and supplies. But my experience told me that rescue might not be coming anytime soon. I made the decision to consolidate our group into fewer rooms to conserve heat. We moved everyone into 2 adjoining suites on the 15th floor, combining our food supplies and pooling our survival gear. I taught them the same resource management protocols I had learned for long-duration space missions. We would eat measured portions at scheduled times. We would maintain activity schedules to keep our bodies warm and our minds occupied. We would assign duties to everyone based on their abilities. Most importantly, we would prepare for the possibility that this situation would last much longer than anyone wanted to admit. The snow continued falling through day 8 and day 9. By the morning of day 10, it was over a foot deep, and the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. The hotel's power was flickering regularly now. We could hear pipes beginning to freeze in the walls, the metal contracting with sharp cracking sounds that echoed through the empty corridors. I spent those days systematically searching abandoned hotel rooms for supplies. In space, you learn to inventory everything that might be useful for survival. I found prescription medications left behind by departed guests, extra blankets and towels, toiletries, and most importantly, food that people had packed in their luggage or purchased from vending machines. The baby's cough was getting worse. Lisa was trying to hide her panic, but I could see it in the way she held her daughter closer, the way she flinched every time the baby coughed. She asked me if I knew anything about treating respiratory infections, and I had to admit that my medical training was limited to basic emergency care for healthy adults in space. Infants were completely outside my expertise. Harold was having chest pains more frequently. He tried to hide them from Margaret, but I caught him holding his chest and breathing carefully several times throughout each day. He pulled me aside one evening and told me that his heart medication would last maybe another week if he rationed it carefully. He asked me not to tell Margaret because he didn't want her to worry. I promised I wouldn't, but I started making mental calculations about what we would do when his medication ran out. On day 10, the hotel lost power completely. We woke up in darkness to the sound of the heating system shutting down with a final mechanical sigh. The temperature in our rooms dropped from 60 degrees to 55 degrees within hours. I knew that without heat, we would be fighting hypothermia within days. That was when I remembered the camping stove I had bought from the hotel gift shop. It wasn't designed to heat rooms, but it could provide some warmth and allow us to melt snow for drinking water. I also remembered seeing a fireplace in the hotel's conference room on the second floor. If we could find wood to burn, we might be able to create a warm space for the group. I explained the situation to everyone. We needed to move to a smaller space that we could heat more effectively. We needed to start melting snow for water since the pipes were freezing. We needed to accept that we might be here for weeks, not days, and plan accordingly. Margaret started crying when I said weeks. Harold put his arm around her and told her everything would be fine, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Lisa just held her baby tighter and asked me what we needed to do. I led them down to the conference room, carrying our supplies and the few pieces of furniture we could use for burning. The fireplace was decorative, but it would work for providing heat and light. I sent everyone to search the hotel for anything that would burn while I worked on getting a fire started. We spent that night huddled around a fire made from wooden chairs and desk drawers, rationing granola bars and melting snow in a metal wastebasket I had found in the business center. The baby coughed through most of the night, keeping all of us awake. Lisa looked exhausted and desperate. She kept asking me if I thought rescue teams were coming, if I thought the situation would improve soon. I told her what she needed to hear, not what I actually believed. I said that emergency services were probably establishing supply routes, that the military was likely mobilizing resources, that we just needed to hold on a little longer. But privately, I was calculating our food, supplies, and realizing that even with careful rationing, we had maybe 2 weeks of nutrition for 5 people and a nursing mother. Day 11 brought new challenges. The snow was now 18 inches deep and showed no signs of stopping. The temperature had dropped to 31 degrees, just below freezing. Our makeshift heating system was keeping the conference room at about 45 degrees, which was survivable but uncomfortable. More importantly, I was starting to hear sounds from other parts of the hotel. Voices echoing through empty corridors, doors slamming, footsteps on the floors above us. Other people had apparently decided to stay in the building rather than venture out into the snow, but they weren't making any effort to coordinate with our group. I made the decision to investigate these other survivors. In space, when you encounter other crew members during an emergency, you coordinate resources and efforts to maximize everyone's chances of survival. I assumed the same principle would apply here. I was wrong about that too. I found them on the 7th floor, a group of 6 men who had been attending some kind of business conference when the disaster started. They had barricaded themselves into a large suite and were burning furniture for heat just like we were. But when I knocked on their door and introduced myself, their response was hostile and suspicious. Their leader, a heavy-set man with a Chicago accent, told me through the door that they weren't interested in sharing resources or coordinating efforts. They had their own supplies and their own plans. He suggested I take care of my own group and leave them alone. When I tried to explain that cooperation would improve everyone's chances of survival, he told me to get lost before something unfortunate happened. I backed away from their door, but I could hear them talking after I left. They were discussing whether they should take our supplies by force. They were calculating how long their own food would last. They were talking about difficult decisions they might have to make soon. I realized that not all survivors were going to behave like astronauts in an emergency. Some people respond to crisis by helping others. Some people respond by taking whatever they need to survive, regardless of the cost to anyone else. When I got back to our conference room, I told the others that there were more survivors in the building, but that we should avoid contact with them for safety reasons. Harold asked me if there was some kind of problem, and I explained that resource scarcity could make people unpredictable. Margaret looked frightened, and Lisa clutched her baby closer. That night, while the others slept, I stayed awake listening for sounds from the rest of the hotel. I heard voices, footsteps, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. At one point, I heard what might have been an argument, but I couldn't make out the words. I made a mental note to be more careful about our security and to keep our group's presence as quiet as possible. Day 12 brought a small miracle and a terrible realization. The miracle was finding a battery-powered radio in the hotel manager's office. When I turned it on, I actually picked up a signal from what sounded like an emergency broadcast station. The voice was professional and calm, repeating information about rescue operations and supply drops for stranded civilians. According to the broadcast, FEMA had established emergency shelters in major cities and was coordinating with local authorities to reach isolated groups of survivors. They provided coordinates for collection points where people could wait for evacuation. The closest one to us was at the Colorado Convention Center about 6 blocks away. For the first time in days, we had hope. I showed the others our location on a hotel map and traced the route to the convention center. 6 blocks through snow and cold, but definitely manageable for our group. The radio said that rescue teams were operating on a priority basis, with families with children and elderly individuals being evacuated first. Lisa started crying with relief. Margaret and Harold held hands and smiled for the first time since this nightmare started. Everyone began talking about what they would do when they got home, about the people they would call, about how grateful they would be for normal life. But the terrible realization came when I tried to contact the emergency frequency to report our location and group size. The radio was receive only. I couldn't transmit to let anyone know we were here or that we needed help. We could hear the rescue operations, but we couldn't participate in them until we physically reached the collection point. That meant leaving the relative safety and warmth of our conference room and venturing out into conditions that had already killed an unknown number of people. It meant carrying a sick baby and supporting an elderly man with heart problems through 18 inches of snow and below freezing temperatures. I explained the situation to the group. We could stay here and hope that rescue teams would eventually search every building in downtown Denver, or we could make the journey to the convention center where help was definitely available. The radio broadcast indicated that rescue operations were scheduled to continue for at least another week, so we had time to prepare and plan our route carefully. Everyone agreed that we should make the attempt. Lisa said she would rather take the risk than watch her baby get sicker in the cold hotel. Harold said that 6 blocks wasn't that far, and that he felt strong enough to make the walk. Margaret worried about slowing everyone down, but I assured her that we would move as a group and take as much time as necessary. We spent the rest of day 12 preparing for the journey. I scouted the route from the hotel windows, identifying landmarks and potential shelter points along the way. I organized our supplies into backpacks that everyone could carry, keeping emergency food and medical supplies distributed among the group in case we got separated. I found warmer clothing in abandoned guest rooms and made sure everyone had adequate protection for the cold. Most importantly, I established our contingency plans. If someone got injured or couldn't continue, the rest of the group would help them reach the nearest building for shelter, while I continued to the convention center to bring back help. If we encountered other groups of survivors, we would be polite but cautious about sharing information about our supplies or destination. The baby seemed a little better that day. Her cough was less frequent and she was nursing normally. Lisa said she felt optimistic about making the journey, and I hoped she was right. Harold's chest pains seemed less severe, though I noticed he was taking deeper breaths more often, like he was testing his lung capacity. That night, I lay awake listening to the radio broadcasts and planning our route. The emergency frequency repeated the same information every 30 minutes, including weather updates that weren't encouraging. The temperature was expected to drop further over the next few days with continued snowfall predicted, but the broadcasts also confirmed that rescue operations were active and that evacuation flights were departing regularly from Denver International Airport. All we had to do was reach the convention center, 6 blocks through the worst weather Denver had ever experienced, carrying a baby and supporting 2 elderly people, while avoiding other survivors who might not have our best interests at heart. In space, we call that kind of plan optimistically complicated. But sometimes optimistically complicated plans are the only ones that offer any hope of survival. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I could hear the wind picking up outside, blowing snow against the conference room windows. The fire in our makeshift fireplace was burning low, and the temperature in the room was dropping. Tomorrow we would either take the first step toward rescue, or we would discover just how dangerous the new world had become. Either way, we couldn't stay here much longer. Our food supplies were dwindling, Harold's medication was running out, and the baby needed medical attention that we couldn't provide. The conference room had kept us alive for 3 days, but it wasn't a long-term solution. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine Sarah and Emma waiting for me at home, safe and warm, and wondering why I hadn't called. I tried to picture the reunion we would have when this nightmare was over, the stories I would tell them about surviving the impossible. But deep down, I was starting to understand that the world we were hoping to return to might not exist anymore. The radio broadcast talked about rescue and evacuation, but they didn't talk about what came after. They didn't explain how civilization was supposed to function when summer had turned into the worst winter in human history. Those were questions for later, though. Right now, our only goal was to survive long enough to reach the convention center and find out if rescue was really coming. Everything else would have to wait until we were safe. The wind continued howling outside as I finally fell asleep, carrying with it the sound of a world that had changed forever. Day 13 began with a decision that I thought would save us all. I woke up before dawn and checked the radio for weather updates. The emergency broadcast was reporting that the snowfall had stopped temporarily and that rescue teams were making their final sweep of downtown Denver before moving operations to other areas. If we were going to reach the convention center, today was our best opportunity. I gathered everyone around our dying fire and explained the situation. The temperature outside was 28 degrees, the coldest it had been since this nightmare started. But the snow had stopped falling, and visibility was better than it had been in days. The radio broadcasts indicated that evacuation flights were still departing regularly, and that families with children were being given priority for transport. Harold said he felt strong enough to make the walk. His chest pains had been less severe overnight, and he had been moving around the conference room without difficulty. Margaret was nervous but determined. She said she would rather take the risk than wait any longer in the cold hotel. Lisa was eager to get her baby to medical professionals who could treat the persistent cough that kept us all awake at night. I distributed the supplies we would carry, making sure everyone had emergency food, water, and extra clothing. I kept the radio with me so we could monitor rescue operations while we traveled. The route to the convention center was straightforward, mostly along major streets that would be easier to navigate even with snow cover. We left the hotel at 8 in the morning, stepping out into a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. The snow was nearly 2 feet deep in most places, deeper where it had drifted against buildings and abandoned cars. The air was so cold it burned to breathe, and our breath formed thick clouds that froze before dissipating. But the sky was clearer than it had been in days, and we could actually see the sun as a dim disk through the ash and ice crystals in the atmosphere. The first 2 blocks went better than I had expected. Harold maintained a steady pace, stopping every few minutes to catch his breath but showing no signs of serious distress. Margaret stayed close to me, following in my footsteps to make walking easier through the deep snow. Lisa carried her baby inside her coat to keep her warm, and the baby seemed calm and alert. We passed dozens of abandoned cars buried in snow, their owners long gone in search of shelter or rescue. Some buildings showed signs of recent occupation, with paths cleared to their entrances and smoke rising from improvised heating systems. But we followed my plan to avoid contact with other survivors, staying in the middle of the street and moving as quietly as possible. The 3rd block presented our first real challenge. A city bus had jackknifed across the intersection, blocking our planned route. The snow had drifted around it, creating a barrier that was nearly 4 feet high. I scouted alternate paths while the others rested against a building wall, but every option required significant detours that would add time and distance to our journey. Harold suggested we climb over the bus. The snow had built up enough that we could walk up one side and down the other without too much difficulty. I was concerned about the physical demands this would place on him and Margaret, but after checking our route options, I decided it was our best choice. Margaret made it over first, with me supporting her on the steep sections. Lisa followed, carefully protecting her baby during the climb. Harold came last, moving slowly but steadily. About halfway up the side of the bus, he stopped and placed his hand on his chest. He said he just needed a moment to catch his breath, but I could see the gray pallor in his face that indicated he was pushing his physical limits. We made it over the bus and continued toward the convention center. But Harold's pace was noticeably slower now. He was breathing hard and stopping more frequently. Margaret was getting worried, and I could see the concern in Lisa's eyes. We were barely halfway to our destination, and our weakest member was already showing signs of serious distress. The fourth block brought better news. I could see the convention center in the distance, a large building with smoke rising from multiple points along its roof. There were definitely people there, and it looked like they had established some kind of organized presence. The radio had been accurate about the rescue operations. We just had to cover 2 more blocks. That was when we heard the baby's breathing change. Lisa stopped walking and pulled her daughter out of her coat to check on her. The baby's breathing was rapid and shallow, and her lips had a bluish tint that I recognized as a sign of oxygen deprivation. The cold and exertion of the journey were affecting her more severely than any of us had anticipated. Lisa started crying and begging me to do something. She said her baby was getting worse and needed medical help immediately. I examined the baby as best I could with my limited medical knowledge, but it was clear that she needed professional care beyond anything I could provide. The convention center was still 8 blocks away, but we had to get there as quickly as possible. I made the decision to carry the baby myself, leaving Lisa free to move faster without the extra weight and bulk. I tucked the baby inside my coat and picked up our pace as much as Harold could manage. Margaret and Lisa supported each other, and we pushed forward through the deep snow with new urgency. The 5th block seemed to take forever. Harold was struggling now, stopping every few yards to catch his breath and holding his chest with increasing frequency. The baby's breathing remained rapid and shallow, and I could feel her small body shivering against my chest, despite the layers of clothing. Lisa was crying and asking every few minutes if her baby was okay, but I had no reassuring answers to give her. We finally reached the convention center area, but what we found wasn't what the radio broadcasts had led us to expect. The building was occupied, but not by official rescue personnel. Instead, we found a group of maybe 30 survivors who had claimed the building as their own shelter. They had established a perimeter around the entrances and were clearly suspicious of newcomers. I approached their guards, 2 men who looked like they had been camping in the building for days. I explained that we had a medical emergency and needed to reach the official rescue station. They told me that there was no official rescue station at the convention center. FEMA had established a temporary collection point there for 2 days, but had moved operations to the airport when the weather got worse. The baby was getting worse. Her breathing was more labored, and she felt hot against my chest, despite the cold air. Lisa was begging the guards to let us inside where it was, warm, saying her baby would die if she didn't get help soon, but the guards were firm about their rules. They weren't accepting new people into their group because their resources were already stretched too thin. I tried to negotiate with them, offering to share our supplies in exchange for temporary shelter, while we figured out how to reach the actual rescue operations. But they weren't interested in trading. They had seen too many people die over the past 2 weeks, and they weren't willing to risk their own survival for strangers. That was when Harold collapsed. He had been standing quietly while I negotiated with the guards, but suddenly, he grabbed his chest and fell forward into the snow. Margaret screamed his name and dropped to her knees beside him. I could see immediately that he was having a serious heart attack, probably brought on by the physical stress of our journey and the emotional strain of the emergency. The guards at the convention center watched us dealing with our medical crisis, but made no move to help. One of them told me that we needed to move away from their building because they didn't want other survivors to think they were providing medical assistance. I was holding a dying baby, trying to help Margaret with her husband's heart attack and dealing with Lisa's complete emotional breakdown, all while standing in 2 feet of snow and sub-freezing temperatures. Harold died in my arms about 10 minutes after he collapsed. His heart simply couldn't handle the combination of stress, cold, and physical exertion. Margaret was inconsolable, crying and holding his body while the snow continued to fall around us. Lisa was in shock, staring at Harold's still form while her baby struggled to breathe in my arms. The guards at the convention center told us we needed to move along. They said they were sorry for our loss, but that dead bodies attracted scavengers and other problems they couldn't deal with. They suggested we find shelter elsewhere and wished us luck, but they wouldn't let us inside their building. I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I told Margaret that we couldn't stay with Harold's body, that we had to keep moving to save the baby. She understood intellectually, but emotionally she couldn't handle leaving her husband of 50 years in the snow. I had to physically help her stand up and walk away while she cried and looked back at Harold's body every few steps. We found shelter in an abandoned restaurant 3 blocks away from the convention center. The building had been ransacked, but it still had some protection from the wind and snow. I got a small fire started using broken furniture and papers from the restaurant office. The baby's condition seemed to stabilize in the warmer air, but she was still breathing rapidly and her color wasn't good. That night, Margaret barely spoke or ate. She sat staring at the fire, occasionally crying quietly. Lisa held her baby constantly, talking to her and singing lullabies, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew her daughter was seriously ill and she knew we were running out of options for getting medical help. I tried the radio again, hoping to pick up information about other rescue locations. The emergency broadcast was still repeating the same information about evacuation flights from the airport, but they also mentioned that rescue operations in downtown Denver had been suspended due to deteriorating weather conditions. The convention center collection point had been closed permanently. Day 14 brought new challenges and a devastating loss. The baby died during the night, sometime between midnight and dawn. Lisa woke up to find her daughter cold and still in her arms. The combination of cold exposure, respiratory infection, and stress had been too much for her small body to handle. Lisa's reaction was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. She didn't cry or scream. She just sat holding her dead baby, rocking back and forth and humming lullabies. Margaret tried to comfort her, but Lisa seemed to be in a world of her own, disconnected from reality. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to questions, and wouldn't let go of her baby's body. I had to make another impossible decision. I gently took the baby from Lisa's arms and wrapped her in a blanket. I told Lisa that we needed to bury her daughter properly, that it was important to treat her with dignity and respect. Lisa just stared at me with empty eyes and nodded slowly. We buried the baby in the snow behind the restaurant, marking the spot with a cross made from broken wooden chairs. Margaret said a prayer, and I said a few words about how the baby had been loved, and how her short life had meaning. Lisa stood silently through the whole ceremony, showing no emotion at all. After the burial, Lisa's condition deteriorated rapidly. She wouldn't eat or drink anything. She wouldn't participate in conversations or respond to questions. She just sat by our fire staring at nothing, occasionally whispering her daughter's name. Margaret and I tried everything we could think of to bring her back to reality, but grief had taken her to a place where we couldn't follow. The radio broadcasts on day 15 brought news that changed everything. The emergency frequency announced that rescue operations had been consolidated at Denver International Airport, and that all civilian evacuations would be conducted from that location. But they also announced that ground-based rescue operations had been suspended indefinitely due to deteriorating conditions and resource limitations. The message was clear. If you could reach the airport on your own, evacuation flights were available. If you couldn't reach the airport, you were on your own. The government had determined that rescue operations were too dangerous and too expensive to continue in the downtown area. I explained this to Margaret and Lisa, though I wasn't sure Lisa was really listening. Margaret understood immediately what this meant. The airport was at least 15 miles away, through conditions that had already killed Harold and the baby. In her 70s, with no transportation and limited supplies, she had almost no chance of making that journey. Margaret asked me what I thought we should do. She said she was tired of watching people die, tired of being cold and hungry, tired of hoping for rescue that never came. She asked me if I really believed we could make it to the airport, or if we were just going to die trying like Harold and the baby had died. I told her the truth. I said that the journey to the airport would be extremely dangerous, and that our chances of survival were not good. But I also said that staying in the restaurant would certainly mean death within a week or two, when our remaining food supplies ran out. At least attempting to reach the airport gave us some chance of survival. Lisa spoke for the first time in 2 days. She said she didn't want to go to the airport. She said she wanted to stay with her baby, that she didn't care about being rescued anymore. She said that nothing mattered now that her daughter was dead, and that she just wanted to be left alone. I tried to convince her that her daughter would want her to survive, that giving up wasn't the answer. But Lisa was beyond reasoning with. Grief had broken something inside her that I couldn't fix. She made it clear that she wouldn't be coming with us, regardless of what we decided to do. Margaret and I spent day 16 planning our options. We could stay with Lisa and hope that conditions would improve enough for rescue operations to resume. We could attempt the journey to the airport together, leaving Lisa behind, or we could split up with one of us staying with Lisa while the other tried to reach help. The decision was made for us on day 17. I woke up to find that Lisa had died during the night. She had simply stopped fighting, stopped trying to survive. Her body had given up the same way her spirit had given up when her baby died. I found her curled up by the cold ashes of our fire, looking peaceful for the first time since the baby had gotten sick. Margaret cried for Lisa, but she also seemed relieved that the decision about what to do had been made for us. We couldn't save Lisa, but we could still try to save ourselves. She said she was ready to attempt the journey to the airport, even though she understood the risks involved. That afternoon, we heard sounds coming from the street outside our restaurant, voices, footsteps, and what sounded like people moving systematically through the buildings in our area. I looked through the restaurant's front window and saw a group of men checking abandoned storefronts and restaurants, apparently searching for supplies or other survivors. These weren't rescue personnel. They were survivors like us, but they moved with a purpose and organization that suggested they had been working together for a while. They were also armed with improvised weapons, and their behavior suggested they were willing to take what they needed from anyone they encountered. I pulled Margaret away from the window and explained what I had seen. We needed to avoid contact with this group until we could determine their intentions. In survival situations, desperate people often make desperate choices, and I didn't want to find out what choices these particular people had made. We hid in the restaurant's kitchen, while the group searched the dining area. I could hear them going through the debris looking for anything useful. One of them commented that the building had been thoroughly picked over already, but another voice said they should check the kitchen area anyway. Margaret was terrified, holding my arm and trying not to make any sound. I was calculating whether we could escape through the kitchen's back door if they discovered us, or whether we would have to try to negotiate with them. In space, when you encounter unknown variables, you prepare for multiple scenarios while hoping for the best outcome. The voices moved away from our area without discovering us, but I could hear them continuing their search in other buildings nearby. This group was conducting a systematic sweep of our neighborhood, and they would probably be back. We needed to leave this location as soon as possible. That evening, Margaret and I made our final preparations for the journey to the airport. We packed the last of our food supplies, the radio, and the warmest clothing we could find. We planned our route to avoid major roads where we might encounter other groups of survivors. Most importantly, we accepted that this might be our last chance to reach safety. Margaret asked me if I really believed we could make it 15 miles through the snow and cold. I told her that astronauts are trained to attempt difficult missions, even when the odds of success are low, because sometimes attempting the impossible is the only rational choice available. She smiled at that and said she had always wanted to be an astronaut when she was a little girl. She said that maybe this was her chance to find out what it felt like to go on a dangerous mission to save her own life. As we prepared to leave the restaurant where we had lost Lisa, I tried the radio one more time. The emergency broadcast was still repeating information about evacuation flights from the airport, but they had added a new message warning civilians that ground conditions in the Denver area were extremely hazardous, and that anyone attempting to travel should understand that rescue personnel could not provide assistance to people who became stranded during the journey. The message was clear. We were completely on our own. If we could reach the airport, evacuation was possible. If we couldn't reach the airport, no. One was coming to help us. The government had written off everyone who couldn't save themselves. Margaret and I looked at each other in the dim light of our dying fire. We both understood what lay ahead of us. 15 miles through the worst conditions either of us had ever experienced, with no guarantee that we would find help even if we reached our destination. But the alternative was staying in the restaurant until our food ran out, and then slowly, freezing to death like Lisa had done. We decided to leave at first light, when we would have the maximum amount of daylight for our journey. I estimated that it would take us at least 2 days to reach the airport, assuming we could maintain a reasonable pace and find shelter along the way. That meant we would need to survive at least one night in the open, in temperatures that had already proven deadly. As I settled down to sleep for what might be my last night in the restaurant, I thought about Sarah and Emma. I wondered if they were safe, if they had found shelter, if they were waiting for me to come home. I tried to imagine the reunion we would have when this nightmare was over, but those thoughts seemed increasingly unrealistic. The world had changed in ways that none of us had anticipated. Civilization had broken down faster than anyone had predicted. The government agencies that were supposed to provide emergency assistance had proven inadequate for a disaster of this magnitude. We were learning that modern society was far more fragile than we had ever imagined. But I was also learning that individual people were stronger than I had expected. Margaret, a 70-year-old woman, was preparing to attempt a journey that would challenge someone half her age. Harold had died trying to reach safety for his wife and the people he cared about. Even Lisa had fought to save her baby until the very end, and had only given up when grief became too much to bear. Tomorrow, Margaret and I would find out if we had enough strength left to save ourselves. Either way, we would face whatever came next together, just like astronauts on a mission to unknown territory. The wind picked up outside the restaurant, as I finally drifted off to sleep, carrying with it the sound of a world that had become as alien and hostile as any planet I had ever imagined visiting. Day 18 brought the discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about survival and humanity. Margaret and I left the restaurant at dawn, carrying our meager supplies and following the route I had planned toward Denver International Airport. The temperature was 24 degrees and the snow was now over 2 feet deep in most places. We moved slowly but steadily, with Margaret following in my footsteps to conserve her energy. The first few miles went better than I had expected. Margaret maintained a good pace despite her age, and the clear weather allowed us to navigate efficiently toward our destination. We rested every 30 minutes, sharing small amounts of food and water while staying alert for other survivors, who might pose a threat to our safety. About 3 miles from the restaurant, we encountered something that stopped us in our tracks. I had been leading us through a residential area, staying away from major roads where we might encounter organized groups of survivors, but as we approached an intersection, I noticed drag marks in the snow leading from one house to another. The marks looked like someone had been pulling heavy objects across the snow, but the pattern was wrong for furniture or supplies. The grooves were too narrow and too consistent. As I studied them more carefully, I realized with growing horror that they looked like the marks a human body would make if it were being dragged through the snow. Margaret noticed my concern and asked what I was looking at. I told her I thought we should avoid this area and find an alternate route, but she had already seen the drag marks herself. She asked me directly what I thought had made those marks, and I couldn't lie to her. I said I thought they might be evidence that other survivors in this area were engaging in activities we didn't want to encounter. We were about to change direction when we heard voices coming from one of the houses. They were speaking quietly, but the cold air carried sound clearly enough for us to make out some of their conversation. They were discussing food supplies and talking about how long their current resources would last. But then one voice mentioned something that made my blood freeze. He said they had enough meat for another week if they were careful about rationing. But he also said they would need to find more sources soon, because hunting was getting more difficult as other groups had already cleared most of the available game from the area. Margaret looked at me with wide eyes, and I could see that she understood what we were hearing. These people weren't talking about hunting animals. In a city buried under 2 feet of snow, with most wildlife long dead or fled, there was only one source of meat readily available to desperate survivors. I took Margaret's arm and started leading her away from the intersection as quietly as possible. But as we moved, we heard a door open behind us. Someone had spotted us from one of the houses. A voice called out, asking if we needed help or shelter. The tone was friendly and concerned, exactly what you would expect from someone offering assistance to fellow survivors. Every instinct I had developed in space told me to ignore the voice and keep moving. When you encounter unknown variables in a life-threatening situation, you assume the worst-case scenario until you can prove otherwise. But Margaret was tired from our walk, and the offer of shelter was tempting after so many days of cold and uncertainty. The voice called out again, saying they had warm food and a safe place to rest. The person sounded genuinely concerned about our welfare, asking if we had been walking for a long time and if we needed medical attention. But I noticed that other voices had joined the first one, and I could hear footsteps in the snow behind us. I whispered to Margaret that we needed to keep moving, that something about this situation felt wrong. She trusted my judgment and followed me as we picked up our pace, but I could hear the voices getting closer. The people behind us were following us, and their tone was becoming more insistent about us stopping to accept their help. We reached the next intersection, and I made the decision to run. I told Margaret to follow me as closely as possible while I led us through a maze of backyard fences and abandoned vehicles. Behind us, I could hear our pursuers spreading out to try to cut off our escape routes. Their friendly offers of help had been replaced by more direct commands for us to stop and talk with them. Margaret was breathing hard from the exertion of running through deep snow, but she kept up with me as we dodged between houses and climbed over barriers. I could hear our pursuers calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern like they had done this before. These weren't desperate people acting on impulse. They were organized hunters who had developed systematic methods for capturing other survivors. We managed to lose them in a cluster of apartment buildings about half a mile from the intersection. I found an unlocked storage shed where we could hide while listening for sounds of continued pursuit. Margaret was exhausted and shaking, both from cold and from fear. She asked me if I really thought those people were planning to hurt us. I told her what I had observed. The drag marks in the snow, the conversation about meat supplies, the organized pursuit when we tried to leave the area. Individual pieces of evidence that might have innocent explanations, but taken together painted a picture of survivors who had crossed moral boundaries that most people couldn't imagine crossing. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, processing what I had told her. Then she asked me how people could do such things to other human beings. I explained that extreme stress and starvation could drive people to make choices they would never consider under normal circumstances. In survival situations, some people maintain their humanity while others abandon it in favor of staying alive. We stayed in the storage shed for 2 hours, listening carefully for any sounds that might indicate our pursuers were still searching the area. When I was confident that we had lost them, we resumed our journey toward the airport. But the encounter had changed something fundamental about how we approached other survivors. From that point forward, we avoided any signs of human activity. When we saw smoke rising from buildings, we changed our route to stay away from those areas. When we heard voices or other sounds that indicated the presence of other people, we hid until they passed. The world had become a place where other human beings represented potential threats rather than sources of help. The rest of day 18 was spent making slow but steady progress through residential areas on the outskirts of Denver. The snow was deeper here, and the cold was becoming more intense as we gained elevation. Margaret was showing signs of fatigue, but she remained determined to reach the airport. I estimated that we had covered about 8 miles from our starting point, which meant we were roughly halfway to our destination. We found shelter that evening in an abandoned gas station. The building had been thoroughly ransacked, but it provided protection from the wind and snow. I managed to start a small fire using paper and debris from the station office, and we shared one of our remaining energy bars while planning the next day's route. Margaret asked me about my family, about Sarah and Emma back in Colorado Springs. I told her about how Emma had been learning to dive when I had last spoken with her, about how excited she had been to show me her progress. I told her about Sarah's work as a teacher, about how she always worried about her students and their families. I said I was hoping they had found safety with Sarah's parents, but that I couldn't know for sure until I could contact them somehow. Margaret told me about her grandchildren in Kansas City, about how Harold had been planning to teach their grandson to fish that summer. She said Harold had been looking forward to retirement, to spending more time with family and pursuing hobbies he had never had time for during his working years. She cried a little when she talked about him, but she also smiled when she remembered the plans they had made together. We both understood that the people we had been before this disaster might not exist anymore. The world had changed so fundamentally that our old lives seemed like memories from a completely different reality. But talking about our families gave us something to focus on besides the immediate challenges of survival. Day 19 brought new challenges and a terrible discovery. We left the gas station early and continued our journey through increasingly suburban areas toward the airport. The snow was now almost 3 feet deep, and the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Margaret was moving more slowly, and I could see that the physical demands of our journey were taking a serious toll on her health. About noon, we encountered a roadblock that forced us to make a difficult choice. A major highway that we needed to cross was completely blocked by abandoned vehicles and snowdrifts. The alternative routes would add several miles to our journey, time and distance that Margaret might not be able to handle in her current condition. I decided to investigate the roadblock more closely to see if we could find a way through. As I climbed over the buried cars, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Some of the vehicles had damage that looked too severe to be caused by accidents or weather. Windows were smashed, doors were torn open, and there were dark stains in the snow around several of the cars. In the back seat of one vehicle, I found evidence that confirmed my worst fears about what had happened here. Personal belongings were scattered as if the occupants had been dragged out forcibly. There were signs of a struggle, and the dark stains in the snow weren't from automotive fluids. This roadblock wasn't the result of a traffic jam or accident. It was the result of an organized attack on people trying to evacuate the city. I returned to Margaret and explained what I had found. Other survivors had been using this highway as a hunting ground, stopping evacuees and taking whatever they needed from them. The roadblock was maintained deliberately to trap people who were trying to reach safety at the airport. Margaret asked me if I thought the people who had attacked these cars were still in the area. I said it was possible, but that the evidence looked like it was several days old. The attackers had probably moved on to other locations once this area had been thoroughly exploited, but we couldn't take the risk of encountering them, which meant we would have to find another route. The detour added 4 miles to our journey and took us through terrain that was much more difficult to navigate. Margaret was struggling now, stopping frequently to rest and asking if we could find shelter for an extended break. I was torn between pushing forward to reach the airport before dark and allowing her the rest she clearly needed. We compromised by finding shelter in an abandoned shopping center where we could rest for a few hours while staying protected from the wind. The building had been stripped of anything useful, but it was warmer than being outside. I used some of our remaining fuel to start a small fire, and we shared what might be our last full meal before reaching the airport. Margaret was quiet during our rest break, and I could see that she was calculating her remaining strength against the distance we still needed to travel. She asked me honestly if I thought she could make it to the airport, or if I thought she would collapse before we reached our destination. I told her the truth. I said that the remaining distance would be challenging for anyone, but that she had already proven she was stronger than most people half her age. I said that astronauts succeed at difficult missions by focusing on one small goal at a time, rather than being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the entire task. But privately, I was worried about her condition. She was showing signs of exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and she was having difficulty maintaining her body temperature even when we were sheltered from the wind. I started calculating whether I would be able to continue the journey alone if she became unable to travel. We left the shopping center in mid-afternoon and continued toward the airport. The terrain was becoming more open now, with fewer buildings, to provide shelter if we encountered severe weather. But I could see aircraft landing lights in the distance, which meant we were getting close to our destination. That evening brought the most terrifying encounter of our entire journey. We were crossing an open area between suburban developments when we heard the sound of vehicles approaching. In a world where most cars had been abandoned due to impassable roads, the sound of working engines was both encouraging and alarming. 3 pickup trucks came into view, driving slowly through the snow and scanning the area with mounted spotlights. At first, I thought they might be rescue personnel conducting search operations, but as they got closer, I could see that the people in the trucks were heavily armed and were clearly searching for something specific. Margaret and I hid behind an abandoned car and watched as the trucks methodically searched the area. The people in the vehicles were calling out to any survivors, offering food and shelter to anyone who needed help. But there was something about their behavior that reminded me of the group we had encountered near the intersection 2 days earlier. One of the trucks stopped near our hiding place, and I could hear the occupants discussing their search strategy. They were talking about how many people they had found in the past week, and about how their community was always looking for new members who could contribute useful skills. But they were also talking about screening processes and about people who didn't work out being sent away. The conversation continued, and I started to understand that this wasn't a rescue operation. This was a recruitment operation being conducted by a group that had established some kind of settlement in the area. They were looking for survivors who could be useful to them, but they were also being selective about who they accepted into their community. More disturbing were the comments about people who had been rejected or who had caused problems. The speakers implied that these people had been dealt with permanently, rather than simply being asked to leave. I realized that we were listening to members of a group that had developed its own rules for survival, rules that might not align with conventional morality. The trucks moved on after several minutes, but their presence meant that this area was being actively patrolled by organized groups of survivors. We would need to be extremely careful about how we approached the airport, because we had no way of knowing which groups might be friendly and which ones might view us as threats or resources to be exploited. Margaret asked me what I thought we should do. I said that we needed to reach the airport as quickly as possible, but that we also needed to approach it carefully to avoid being captured by groups like the one we had just observed. The official evacuation operations might provide safety, but we had to survive long enough to reach them. We spent that night in an abandoned house about 5 miles from the airport. I estimated that we could reach our destination by mid-morning if Margaret's strength held up, but I was increasingly concerned about what we would find when we got there. The radio broadcasts had mentioned evacuation flights, but they hadn't provided details about security arrangements or screening procedures for survivors seeking rescue. Day 20 brought our arrival at Denver International Airport and a discovery that changed everything about our expectations for rescue. We approached the airport complex cautiously, staying concealed while observing the activity around the terminals. What we saw wasn't what the radio broadcasts had led us to expect. The airport was definitely operational. We could see aircraft taking off and landing regularly, and there were clearly organized operations taking place around the terminal buildings. But we could also see that access to the airport was strictly controlled by armed personnel who had established checkpoints around the perimeter. More importantly, we could see long lines of survivors waiting outside the terminals in the freezing cold. These people had made the same journey we had made, reaching the airport in hopes of evacuation, but they were being processed slowly and selectively. Many of them appeared to have been waiting for days. I used binoculars that I had found in an abandoned car to observe the screening process more closely. Survivors were being interviewed individually before being allowed to enter the terminal building. Some people were being admitted quickly, while others were being turned away after brief conversations. A significant number of people were being directed to a separate area where they waited for extended periods. Margaret asked me what I thought the screening process involved. I said it appeared that evacuations were being prioritized based on factors like age, health, and possibly professional skills. The people being admitted quickly seemed to be families with young children or individuals who might have specialized knowledge that would be valuable for rebuilding efforts. We watched the process for several hours, trying to understand what criteria were being used for selection. It became clear that not everyone who reached the airport would be evacuated. Resources were limited, and officials were making difficult choices about who deserved rescue and who would be left behind. The realization hit both of us simultaneously. We had survived 18 days of hell, lost friends and family members, and traveled 15 miles through the worst conditions either of us had ever experienced, only to discover that reaching the airport didn't guarantee salvation. We would still have to convince officials that we deserved to be rescued more than other people who had made similar sacrifices to get here. Margaret started crying when she understood what this meant. She said she couldn't handle the possibility of being turned away after everything we had been through. I tried to reassure her that my background as an astronaut might give us advantages in the screening process. But privately, I was calculating the likelihood that a 70-year-old woman would be prioritized for evacuation when resources were limited. That afternoon, we made the decision to approach the checkpoint and submit ourselves to the screening process. We had no other options left. Our food supplies were exhausted, the weather was getting worse, and Margaret's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. If we were going to be rescued, it had to happen soon. As we walked toward the checkpoint, I thought about everything that had led us to this moment. Harold dying in the snow outside the convention center. The baby dying in Lisa's arms. Lisa giving up and dying of grief. The groups of survivors who had turned to cannibalism to stay alive. The organized hunters who were preying on other survivors. I thought about Sarah and Emma, somewhere in Colorado Springs, possibly facing the same kinds of impossible choices that had confronted everyone trying to survive this disaster. I wondered if they were safe, if they had found help, if they were waiting for me to come home. I tried to imagine the reunion we would have when this nightmare was over, but those thoughts seemed increasingly unrealistic as we approached the checkpoint. The world had changed in ways that none of us had anticipated. The government agencies that were supposed to provide emergency assistance had proven inadequate for a disaster of this magnitude. Modern civilization had broken down faster than anyone had predicted. We were learning that survival often came down to individual choices about how far people were willing to go to stay alive. But we were also learning that some people maintained their humanity, even under the worst possible circumstances. Margaret had risked her life to help strangers, and had refused to abandon her moral principles, even when doing so might have improved her chances of survival. Harold had died trying to protect the people he cared about. Even Lisa had fought to save her baby until the very end. As we reached the checkpoint and prepared to face whatever screening process awaited us, I realized that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about maintaining enough of your humanity to make life worth living after the crisis was over. The people who had turned to hunting other survivors might live longer, but they had sacrificed something essential about what it means to be human. The guard at the checkpoint looked at us with tired eyes and asked us to state our names and our reason for seeking evacuation. I identified myself as Commander Jackson Reeves, former NASA astronaut, traveling with Margaret Wilson, a retired teacher from Kansas City. I explained that we were seeking evacuation to rejoin our families and contribute to recovery efforts. The guard made notes on a clipboard and directed us to a waiting area where we would be interviewed by screening personnel. As we walked toward the designated area, I could see dozens of other survivors who were still waiting for their turn to be processed. Some of them had been there for days, sleeping in the cold and sharing meager supplies while hoping for their chance at rescue. I squeezed Margaret's hand and told her that we had made it this far together, and that we would face whatever came next together too. She smiled at me and said that meeting me had been the one good thing to come out of this entire nightmare. She said that Harold would have liked me and that he would have been proud of how we had taken care of each other during our journey. As we settled in to wait for our screening interview, I looked up at the aircraft taking off overhead and wondered where they were going. Were they flying to safety zones where normal life still existed? Were they carrying survivors to refugee camps where they would wait for the world to heal? Or were they simply moving people from one disaster area to another, buying time while civilization figured out how to rebuild itself? Those were questions for later, though. Right now, our only goal was to convince the screening personnel that we deserved to be among the people selected for evacuation. Everything else would have to wait until we were safe, until we could find out what had happened to our families, and until we could begin the long process of rebuilding our lives in whatever remained of the world we had known. The wind picked up as evening approached, blowing snow across the airport complex and reminding all of us that winter was far from over. But for the first time in 20 days, we were within reach of help. Whether that help would actually save us remained to be seen. The screening process at Denver International Airport taught me that surviving 20 days of hell was only the beginning of a much longer nightmare. Margaret and I waited in that freezing holding area for 6 hours before a FEMA official called our names. During those 6 hours, I watched dozens of other survivors get interviewed, and I started to understand the brutal mathematics of evacuation operations. Families with young children were processed quickly and usually approved for immediate departure. Medical professionals, engineers, and people with specialized skills that would be useful for rebuilding efforts were also prioritized. But elderly people, individuals with health problems, and anyone without obvious value to recovery operations were being turned away or placed on indefinite waiting lists. The official who interviewed us was a tired-looking woman in her 40s, who had clearly been working these checkpoints for weeks. She reviewed our identification documents and asked detailed questions about our health status, our professional backgrounds, and our family situations. When I mentioned my NASA experience, her demeanor changed noticeably. She started asking more specific questions about my technical expertise and my experience with life support systems. Margaret's interview went differently. The official was polite, but clearly skeptical about approving evacuation for a 70-year-old woman with no specialized skills and no immediate family waiting for her in designated safe zones. Margaret explained that her children lived in Kansas City, which had been declared a disaster area, and that she had no way of contacting them to confirm their status. The official told us that evacuation flights were severely limited and that priority had to be given to people who had the best chances of long-term survival and the greatest potential to contribute to rebuilding efforts. She said that my NASA background made me a valuable candidate for evacuation, but that Margaret's age and health status made her a lower priority for the limited seats available. I told the official that Margaret and I were traveling together, and that I wouldn't accept evacuation unless she was approved as well. The official looked at me like I was insane. She explained that evacuation opportunities might not be available again for weeks or months, and that refusing this chance might mean being stranded indefinitely in the disaster zone. Margaret tried to convince me to take the evacuation without her. She said that Harold would want her to make sure I got home safely to my family, and that she understood the practical reasons for the prioritization system. But I had made a promise to myself that we would face whatever came next together, and I wasn't going to abandon her after everything we had been through. The official gave us 30 minutes to make a final decision. She said that a flight was departing for Phoenix in 2 hours, and that there was one seat available for me if I was willing to leave immediately. If I chose to stay with Margaret, there was no guarantee that either of us would get another opportunity for evacuation before the airport operations were shut down permanently. During those 30 minutes, Margaret and I had the most difficult conversation of our entire journey. She begged me to take the evacuation flight, saying that my survival was more important than hers because I had family waiting for me and skills that could help other people. I told her that abandoning her would make me no different from the people who had turned to hunting other survivors. Survival without humanity wasn't really survival at all. Margaret started crying and said that she didn't want to be responsible for preventing me from getting home to Sarah and Emma. I told her that Sarah and Emma would never forgive me if I saved myself by abandoning a friend who had helped me survive. We had made it this far together, and whatever happened next, we would face it together. I returned to the official and declined the evacuation seat. She shook her head and marked something on her clipboard. She told us that we could remain in the holding area until space became available on future flights, but that she couldn't provide any timeline for when that might happen. She also warned us that airport operations were being scaled back due to deteriorating weather conditions and resource limitations. Margaret and I found space in a corner of the holding area and settled in to wait with dozens of other survivors who had been deemed non-essential for immediate evacuation. The area was essentially a refugee camp inside an airport terminal, with people sleeping on the floor and sharing whatever food and supplies they had managed to bring with them. That first night in the holding area, I met other survivors who had stories similar to ours. A retired firefighter from Boulder had lost his wife during the journey to the airport, but was determined to reach his daughter in California. A nurse from Colorado Springs had been separated from her family when their evacuation convoy was attacked by scavengers, and she was hoping to find information about other survivors from her area. The nurse, whose name was Patricia, asked me if I had come from Colorado Springs. When I told her that my family was there, she said she might have information that could help me. She had been working at one of the emergency shelters in the city when she was evacuated, and she remembered processing several families with the last name Reeves. My heart stopped when she said that. I asked her to tell me everything she could remember about those families. Patricia said that the shelter records had been lost when their convoy was attacked, but that she specifically remembered a woman named Sarah with a 12-year-old daughter who had been asking about a husband who worked for NASA. The woman had mentioned that her husband was supposed to be in Denver on business when the disaster started. I could barely breathe when Patricia told me this. She said that Sarah and Emma had been at the shelter as recently as 2 weeks ago, and that they had been healthy and safe when she last saw them. But she also said that the shelter had been evacuated when food supplies ran low, and that families had been transported to other locations that she couldn't identify. This was the first concrete information I had received about my family since the disaster began. They had been alive and safe 2 weeks ago, but they had been moved to an unknown location as part of evacuation operations. I asked Patricia if she had any idea where evacuated families might have been taken, but she said the convoy had been attacked before reaching its destination. Margaret saw the hope and desperation in my eyes when I learned this information. She said that finding my family was more important than waiting for evacuation flights that might never come. She suggested that I should leave the airport and attempt to reach Colorado Springs to search for information about where Sarah and Emma had been taken. The idea of leaving the relative safety of the airport to venture back into the disaster zone terrified me. But the possibility that my family was alive and looking for me made staying at the airport feel like giving up on the most important thing in my life. I spent that night calculating the risks and benefits of attempting to reach Colorado Springs versus waiting indefinitely for evacuation that might never come. Day 21 brought new information that made my decision for me. Patricia introduced me to another survivor who had more recent information about evacuation operations in Colorado Springs. This man, a former park ranger named David, had been part of a convoy that had attempted to reach Denver just a week earlier. David told me that most of the emergency shelters in Colorado Springs had been consolidated into one location at an elementary school on the south side of the city. Families who had been separated during various evacuation attempts were being directed to check in at this school, which was serving as a central coordination point for survivor registration and family reunification efforts. More importantly, David said that the school was being supplied by airdrops from military aircraft, and that it had become a relatively stable safe zone for survivors who couldn't be evacuated immediately. He estimated that several hundred people were currently sheltering at the school, including many families with children who were waiting for news about missing relatives. This information changed everything about my decision-making process. Instead of searching blindly through a destroyed city, I would have a specific destination where my family might be waiting for me. The elementary school was about 20 miles from the airport, a difficult but manageable journey if I could find transportation or if I was willing to walk. Margaret insisted that she was coming with me. She said that she had no family waiting for her anywhere else, and that helping me find my family would give her something meaningful to focus on during whatever time she had left. I tried to convince her that the journey would be too dangerous for someone in her condition, but she was adamant about not being left behind. David offered to guide us to Colorado Springs in exchange for a share of any supplies we could gather for the journey. He said he knew routes that would avoid the most dangerous areas where scavenger groups were known to operate. He also said he had contacts at the elementary school who could help us get information about missing persons once we arrived. We spent day 22 preparing for what might be our final journey. I traded some of my remaining astronaut gear to other survivors in exchange for winter clothing, food supplies, and a hand-drawn map of safe routes between the airport and Colorado Springs. Margaret insisted on carrying her share of the supplies despite her age and declining physical condition. The FEMA official who had interviewed us tried one more time to convince me to take an evacuation seat that had become available. She said that leaving the airport to search for missing family members was essentially suicide, and that my technical skills were too valuable to waste on what she called a hopeless mission. I thanked her for the opportunity, but told her that some things were more important than personal survival. That evening, as we prepared to leave the airport, I met a family who had been separated and reunited at the school in Colorado Springs, just days earlier. The father told me that the school was indeed serving as a coordination center for missing persons and that new arrivals were checking in constantly. He said that if my family was anywhere in the Colorado Springs area, the school would be the most likely place to find information about them. He also warned me about the journey ahead. The roads between the airport and Colorado Springs were controlled by various groups of survivors, some friendly and some hostile. Travelers needed to be prepared for anything from helpful assistance to armed robbery. The weather was getting worse daily, and several people had died attempting to make similar journeys in the past week. Despite these warnings, I felt more hopeful than I had since the disaster began. For the first time in 3 weeks, I had a concrete plan for finding my family and a specific destination where they might be waiting for me. The journey would be dangerous, but it was better than waiting indefinitely for evacuation that might never come. Day 23 was departure day. Margaret, David, and I left the airport before dawn, carrying our supplies and following David's planned route toward Colorado Springs. The temperature was 15 degrees, and fresh snow was falling steadily, but I felt energized by the possibility that this journey might lead me back to Sarah and Emma. The first part of our journey took us through suburban areas that had been largely abandoned. Most of the houses were buried under snow, and there were no signs of recent human activity. David explained that this area had been evacuated early in the disaster, before the roads became completely impassable. Most of the residents had either reached safety zones or had died attempting to evacuate. Around midday, we encountered our first group of other travelers. A family of 4 was walking in the same direction we were, carrying everything they owned, in backpacks and pulling supplies on a makeshift sled. They had been living in an abandoned warehouse near the airport and had decided that staying put was more dangerous than attempting to reach the coordination center in Colorado Springs. David suggested that we travel together for safety and mutual assistance. The father of the family agreed, saying that larger groups were less likely to be targeted by scavengers than individual travelers. The mother was carrying a baby who appeared to be healthy, which gave me hope that children could survive this disaster with proper care and attention. Our combined group made good progress through the afternoon, covering about 8 miles before stopping to rest in an abandoned gas station. The building provided shelter from the wind and snow, and we were able to start a small fire using debris from the station office. We shared food and planned our route for the next day while taking turns standing watch for potential threats. That evening, the father of the family asked me about my background and how I had learned survival skills. When I told him about my NASA experience, he said that his brother was an engineer who had always wanted to be an astronaut. He asked me what space was like, and for a few minutes we were able to have a normal conversation about something other than survival and disaster. Margaret was holding the baby while her mother rested, and I could see the joy in Margaret's eyes as she talked to the infant. She told me that this reminded her of when her own grandchildren were babies, and that helping take care of this family made her feel useful. Again, despite everything we had been through, she was still finding ways to maintain her humanity and help other people. Day 24 brought new challenges and a close call that reminded us how dangerous our journey really was. We left the gas station early and continued toward Colorado Springs, but David was concerned about reports he had heard regarding increased scavenger activity in the area we needed to cross. Around noon, we spotted smoke rising from a cluster of buildings ahead of us. David said this could indicate either a safe shelter where survivors were maintaining fires for warmth, or a trap set by scavengers to attract travelers. We decided to investigate carefully while staying prepared to retreat if necessary. As we got closer, we could see that the buildings were occupied by a group of survivors who had established some kind of community. They had cleared paths between buildings and appeared to be sharing resources and working together. But David was still cautious about making contact, since appearances could be deceiving when people were desperate. We were debating whether to approach the community when we heard vehicles approaching from behind us. 2 pickup trucks were coming up the road we had just traveled, moving faster than seemed safe for the snow conditions. David immediately led us off the road and into hiding behind an abandoned building. The truck stopped near the community we had been observing. Armed men got out and began shouting at the people in the buildings, demanding that they hand over food supplies and any valuable items they had collected. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was an organized raid being conducted by people who had decided that taking from others was easier than trying to survive on their own. We watched from hiding as the residents of the community tried to negotiate with the raiders. But it quickly became clear that the raiders weren't interested in fair exchange or cooperation. They were taking whatever they wanted and threatening violence against anyone who resisted their demands. The family we were traveling with was terrified by what we were witnessing. The mother was crying quietly while trying to keep her baby from making noise that might reveal our location. The father was looking at me and David with desperate eyes, asking silently what we should do if the raiders discovered us. David whispered that we needed to stay hidden until the raiders left, then find an alternate route that would avoid areas where they might be operating. He said that groups like this often controlled significant territory and that travelers who encountered them rarely escaped without losing everything they carried. The raid lasted about an hour. When the trucks finally left, we could see that the community had been stripped of most of their visible supplies. Some of the residents were injured, and everyone appeared to be in shock. David said that approaching them now would be risky, since desperate people sometimes turned on strangers who they perceived as threats or competitors for scarce resources. We found an alternate route that added several miles to our journey, but kept us away from the main roads where the raiders might be operating. The detour took us through more difficult terrain, and Margaret was struggling with the additional physical demands. But everyone agreed that avoiding the raiders was more important than maintaining our original schedule. That evening, we found shelter in an abandoned church about 15 miles from the airport. The building had been damaged by the weight of snow on the roof, but it was still structurally sound and provided protection from the weather. The father of the family we were traveling with said a prayer for our safety and for the people we had seen being victimized by the raiders. Margaret was exhausted from the day's exertion, and I was concerned about her ability to continue the journey. She insisted that she was fine, but I could see that the stress and physical demands were taking a serious toll on her health. I started calculating whether our group would be able to maintain our current pace, or whether we would need to find shelter and rest for an extended period. Day 25 brought us within sight of Colorado Springs and the end of our journey from the airport. The city was buried under snow like everywhere else we had traveled, but we could see smoke rising from multiple locations throughout the urban area. People were definitely still alive and active in the city, which gave me hope that the elementary school was still operating as a coordination center. David led us through residential areas on the outskirts of the city, avoiding main roads and commercial districts where we might encounter organized groups of survivors. The family we were traveling with was also looking for missing relatives, and they were as eager as I was to reach the coordination center and search for information about their loved ones. Around noon, we encountered a checkpoint manned by survivors, who appeared to be conducting some kind of security operation for the city. Unlike the raiders we had observed the day before, these people were organized and professional in their approach. They asked us about our destinations and our reasons for entering the city, but they didn't demand tribute or threaten violence. The checkpoint guards told us that several areas of Colorado Springs were under the control of different survivor groups, and that travelers needed to be careful about which neighborhoods they entered. The elementary school coordination center was located in a relatively safe area, but reaching it required crossing territory controlled by a group that wasn't always friendly to outsiders. They gave us specific directions for reaching the school while avoiding the most dangerous areas. They also warned us that the coordination center was overcrowded and understaffed, and that finding information about missing persons could take time. But they confirmed that families were being reunited there regularly, which gave me hope that my search might be successful. The final approach to the elementary school took us through a neighborhood that showed signs of organized survivor activity. Gardens had been established in yards, paths had been cleared between houses, and people were visible working together on various projects. This looked like a community that had adapted to the new reality, rather than simply struggling to survive. Day by day. When we finally reached the elementary school, I was amazed by what I found. The building and surrounding area had been transformed into a functioning refugee camp that was housing several hundred people. Tents and temporary shelters filled the playground, and smoke was rising from cooking fires and heating systems throughout the complex. More importantly, there were signs posted throughout the area with information about missing persons searches, family reunification services, and coordination with other survivor communities. This was exactly what Patricia and David had told me it would be, a central location where separated families could find each other and coordinate their survival efforts. Margaret and I approached the main information desk, which was set up in the school's lobby. A volunteer asked us about our situation and our search objectives. When I told her that I was looking for my wife, Sarah, and daughter, Emma, she checked a registration log and told me that several families with the name Reeves had checked in at various times over the past few weeks. She couldn't give me specific information immediately, but she directed me to a bulletin board where people posted messages for missing family members. As I walked toward the board, my heart was pounding with hope and fear. After 25 days of hell, I was finally going to find out what had happened to my family. The bulletin board was covered with hundreds of handwritten messages from people searching for lost relatives. I scanned through them quickly, looking for anything that mentioned Sarah or Emma or the Reeves family name. Most of the messages were heartbreaking accounts of families torn apart by the disaster, but they also showed the determination of people who refused to give up hope of reunion. Then I saw it. A note written in Sarah's handwriting posted just 3 days earlier. It said that Sarah and Emma Reeves were staying at the school and looking for Jackson Reeves, who had been in Denver when the disaster started. They were checking the bulletin board daily for messages and could be found in classroom 7 during the evening hours. I couldn't breathe when I saw that note. After 25 days of uncertainty and fear, I had proof that my family was alive and safe. They were here in this building waiting for me just like I had been searching for them. Margaret started crying when she saw my reaction, and she hugged me while I tried to process the overwhelming relief and joy I was feeling. The volunteer at the information desk told me that evening hours began at 6 o'clock, and that I could check classroom 7 at that time. I'd found my family, but I still had to wait 2 more hours before I could see them. Those 2 hours felt longer than the previous 25 days combined. As 6 o'clock approached, I walked down the school hallway toward classroom 7 with Margaret beside me. She had insisted on coming with me to meet the family she had heard so much about during our journey. After everything we had been through together, she wanted to be there for the reunion she had helped make possible. I stopped outside the classroom door and took a deep breath. In a few seconds, I would see Sarah and Emma for the first time since this nightmare began. I would find out what they had been through, how they had survived, and what our future looked like in this changed world. I would finally learn whether the family I had been fighting to reach still existed, or whether the disaster had changed us all too fundamentally for normal relationships to resume. Margaret squeezed my hand and told me that this was the moment we had been working toward since we met in that hotel conference room. She said that Harold would have been proud to see me reunited with my family, and that helping me reach this point had given meaning to everything she had endured during our journey. I opened the classroom door and stepped inside, finally ready to discover what came after survival.